Hey everyone, welcome back and thank you for being here. So this is part four of the lecture series on Mill's utilitarianism um, and consequentialism as well, right? An outgrowth of Bentham. This is the second take because there was some dog barking in the last one. So first we're going to read, we just finished John Troyer's Introduction in the Classical Utilitarians by Hackett Publishing, and we've got this excerpt from The Rationale of Reward by Jeremy Bentham on pushpin versus poetry. So let's start there. And then Mill will respond to it when we get down to it. So this is where Bentham basically argues um, that if that like pleasure is equal across activities, um, that it can be quantified, or at least it there's no sort of like hierarchy or elitism or prejudice about what produces a good life. The utility of all these arts and sciences, I speak both of those of amusement and curiosity. The value which what they possess is exactly in proportion to the pleasure they yield. Every other species of preeminence which may be attempted to be established among them is altogether fanciful. Prejudice apart, the game of pushpin is of equal value with the arts and sciences of music and poetry. If the game of pushpin furnish more pleasure, it is more valuable than either. Everybody can play at pushpin. Poetry and music are relished only by a few. The game of pushpin is always innocent. It were well could the same be always asserted of poetry. Indeed, between poetry and truth there is natural opposition, false morals and fictitious nature. The poet always stands in need of something false. When he pretends to lay his foundations in truth, the ornaments of his superstructure are fictions. His business consists in stimulating our passions and exciting our prejudices. Truth, exactitude of every kind, is fatal to poetry. The poet must see everything through colored media and strive to make everyone else do the same. It is true there have been noble spirits to whom poetry and philosophy have been equally indebted, but these exceptions do not counteract the mischiefs which have resulted from this magic art. If poetry and music deserve to be preferred before a game of pushpin, it must be because they are calculated to gratify those individuals who are most difficult to be pleased. Rude. All right, Mill's Utilitarianism, chapter one. And chapter one's much shorter than chapter two. I don't I think chapter one is just kind of like an introduction or general remarks. I think it's only like, I don't know how many pages it is. John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism, chapter one, general remarks. There are few circumstances among those which make up the present condition of human knowledge more unlike what might have been expected, or more significant of a backward state, in which speculation on the most important subject still lingers, than a little progress which has been made in the decision of the controversy respecting the criterion of right and wrong. So, he's basically saying that's a long sentence. He's basically saying that there are a few situations or debates um, in our current intellect or social knowledge set um, with such significant consequences as sorry, thought we heard something. Hold on, I gotta check this. All right, yeah, sorry. It was a weird sound, but there's nothing outside and the door's locked. Uh, Lights are off now. Anyway, it's just past sunset. It's also Halloween. Um, all of these John Stuart Mill videos have been recorded on Halloween 2025. Um, few debates, few conundrums left in the human mind, few things to figure out among us with such significant consequences as how to figure out what's right and wrong. From the dawn of philosophy, the question concerning the summum bonum, or what is the same thing, concerning the foundation of morality, has been accounted the main problem in speculative thought, has occupied the most gifted intellects, and divided them into sects and schools, carrying on a vigorous warfare against one another. And after more than 2,000 years, the same discussions continue. Philosophers are still ranged under the same contending banners, and neither thinkers nor mankind at large seem near to being unanimous on the subject than when the youth Socrates listened to the old Protagoras and asserted, if Plato's dialogue be grounded on a real conversation, the theory of utilitarianism against the popular morality of the so-called sophist. Winchester, stop. It is true that similar confusion and uncertainty, and in some cases, similar discordance exist, respecting the first principles of all the sciences, not accepting that which is deemed the most certain of them, mathematics, without much impairing, generally indeed without impairing at all, the trustworthiness of the conclusions of those sciences. An apparent anomaly, the explanation of which is that the detailed doctrines of a science are not usually deduced from, nor depend for their evidence upon, what are called its first principles. Were it not so, there would be no science more precarious, or whose conclusions were more insufficiently made out than algebra, which derives none of its certainty from what are commonly taught to learners as its elements, since these, as laid down by some of its most eminent teachers, are as full of fictions as English law, and of mysteries as theology. The truths which are ultimately accepted as the first principles of a science are really the last results of metaphysical analysis practiced on the elementary notions with which the science is conversant. Fairly close to Bergson's position. And their relation to the science is not that of foundations to an edifice, but of roots to a tree, which may perform their office equally well, though they though they be never dug down to and exposed to light. But though in science the particular truths, there's also some degree of parallel between utilitarianism as an empiricism, because it's a posteriori, and deontology as a rationalism because it's a priori, and it is a pure philosophy. But there are other parallels along this, right? Plato being a rationalist, Aristotle being an empiricist, Aristotle being a multiplicitist. Um, not a dualist per se, but maybe just a manyist, pluralist. Um, and Plato being a monist. Actually, you can read those both ways. And you can cut the similar distinctions in all sorts of um Berkeley, for instance, was an empirical idealist, right? Which means everything is mind, and we know that through experience, which makes sense. It's pretty close to phenomenology. Um, I don't know if he's a dualist or not. He did distinguish from Spinoza in some way. Different countries. Berkeley was English, Spinoza Dutch, and taking refuge elsewhere. Forget where. Anyway, that's all to say you can think interesting consequences or implications or cross references or analyses between different philosophers' arguments in different schools of thought, like epistemology or morality or metaphysics or ontology, right? Monism, dualism is like, what's the fundamental substance, mind, matter? How do we know it? Through experience, through reason, through eidetics. That's epistemology. Fundamental substance being metaphysics and ontology. Um, Dewey, when we do some aesthetics in my intro class, John Dewey's pragmatist aesthetics takes the back and forth dynamic integration of unity and multiplicity as necessary for the production of lived temporal aesthetic experience, which is fun. I'm really trying to get over to that lecture series. It's more fun than this one. But though in science the particular truths precede the general theory, the contrary might be expected to be the case with a practical art, such as morals or legislation. All action is for the sake of some end, and rules of action, it seems natural to suppose, must take their whole character and color from the end to which they are subservient. When we engage in pursuit, a clear and precise conception of what we are pursuing would seem to be the first thing we need, instead of the last we are to look forward to. A test of right and wrong must be the means when we think of ascertaining what is right or wrong, and not a consequence of having already ascertained it. So, like I was saying, rationalism versus empiricism in that paragraph, basically. How do we determine the right and the wrong? How do we know what's true and false? Excuse me, false. The difficulty is not avoided by having recourse to the popular theory of a natural faculty, a sense of instinct, impulse or eidetics or intuition, informing us of right and wrong. For, besides that, the existence of such a moral instinct is itself, or phronesis in wisdom in Aristotle, is itself one of the matters in dispute. Those believers in it who have any pretensions to philosophy have been obliged to abandon the idea that it discerns what is right or wrong in the particular case in hand, as their other senses discern the sight or sound actually present. Our moral faculty, according to all those of its interpreters who are entitled to the name of thinkers, supplies us only with the general principles of moral judgments. It is a branch of our reason, not of our sensitive faculty, and must be looked to for the abstract doctrines of morality, not for perception of it in the concrete. The intuitive, no less than what may be termed the inductive school of ethics, insists on the necessity of general laws. They both agree that the morality of an individual action is not a question of direct perception, but of the application of a law to an individual case. They recognize also, to a great extent, the same moral laws, but differ as to their evidence and the source from which they derive their authority. Um, Internalism and externalism is also another debate about like rationalism and empiricism. It's very similar. Rationalism and empiricism became more of a historical heuristic in some sense. My understanding is that Descartes started the string of rationalists, and then the string of rationalists prompted the English empiricists to respond. But differ as to their evidence and the source from which they derive their authority. According to the one opinion, the principles of morals are evident a priori before experience, requiring nothing. Uh, that might not be what a priori means. It is like the same thing, but translate Latin to Okay. Yeah, I was confused where the what the A was what consistently meant in Latin across a priori and a posteriori. Because it wasn't experience, right? You can't say like, but the experience is implied. Well, experience really isn't a constitutive component of what it means to be a priori. Um, it could be pre-reflective or non-reflective. Um, Sorry, I don't hold my neck. Oh, there we go. We're back. Okay, Control W, close a tab. From what was prior, what was earlier, requiring nothing to command assent except, again, assent here mean, or always. We've covered assent before. Um, Assent means to, it's kind of like consent, but you it's sort of kind of like an adherence, but it's also kind of like an agreeance. It's when you like agree that something is true. You like mentally, but it's a felt experience. Um, Except that the meaning of the terms be understood. See the whole sentence again. According to the one opinion, the principles of morals are evident a priori, requiring nothing to command assent except that the meaning of the terms be understood. According to the other doctrine, right and wrong, as well as truth and falsehood, are questions of observation and experience, but both hold equally that morality must be deduced from principles, and the intuitive school affirm as strongly as the inductive that there is a science of morals. Yet they seldom attempt to make out a list of the a priori principles, which are to serve as the premises of the science. Still more rarely do they make any effort to reduce those various principles to one first principle or common ground of obligation. They either assume the ordinary precepts of morals as of a priori authority, or they lay down as the common groundwork of those maxims some generality much less obviously authoritative than the maxims themselves, and which has never succeeded in gaining popular acceptance. Yet, to support their pretensions, there ought either to be some one fundamental principle or law at the root of all morality, or if there be several, there should be a determinate order of precedence among them, and the one principle or the rule for deciding between the various principles when they conflict ought to be self-evident. To inquire how far the bad effects of this deficiency have been mitigated in practice, or to what extent the moral beliefs of mankind have been vitiated or made uncertain by the absence of any distinct recognition of an ultimate standard, would imply a complete survey and criticism of past and present ethical doctrine. It would, however, be easy to show that whatever steadiness or consistency these moral beliefs have attained has been mainly due to the tacit influence of a standard not recognized. Although the non-existence of an acknowledged first principle has made ethics not so much a guide as a consecration of men's actual sentiments, still, as men's sentiments, both of favor and of aversion, are greatly influenced by what they suppose to be the effects of things upon their happiness, the principle of utility, or as Bentham latterly called it, the greatest happiness principle, has had a large share in forming the moral doctrines even of those who most scornfully reject its authority. Nor is there any school of thought which refuses to admit that the influence of actions on happiness is a most material and even predominant consideration in many of the details of morals, however unwilling to acknowledge it as the fundamental principle of morality and the source of moral obligation. I might go much further and say that to all those a priori moralists who deem it necessary to argue at all, utilitarian arguments are indispensable. It is not my present purpose to criticize these thinkers, but I cannot help referring, for illustration, to a systematic treatise by one of the most illustrious of them, The Metaphysics of Ethics by Kant. This wasn't the grounding for the metaphysics of morals that we just went through. This was like the more descriptive, mixed in one. I think it was the middle one. This remarkable man, whose system of thought will long remain one of the landmarks in the history of philosophical speculation, does, in the treatise in question, lay down a universal first principle as the origin and ground of moral obligation. It is this: so act that the rule on which thou actest would admit of being adopted as a law by all rational beings. But when he begins to deduce from this precept any of the actual duties of morality, he fails almost grotesquely to show that there would be any contradiction, any logical, not to say physical impossibility, in the adoption by all rational beings of the most outrageously immoral rules of conduct. All he shows is that the consequences of their universal adoption would be such as no one would choose to incur. On the present occasion, I shall, without further discussion of the other theories, attempt to contribute something toward the understanding and appreciation of the utilitarian or happiness theory, and toward such proof as it is susceptible of. It is evident this cannot be proof in the ordinary and popular meaning of the term. Questions of ultimate goods are not amenable to direct proof. Whatever can be proved to be good must be so by being shown to be a means of something admitted to be good without proof. The medical art is proved to be good by its conducing to health. But how is it possible to prove that health is good? The art of music is good for the reason, among others, that it produces pleasure, but what proof is it possible to give that pleasure is good? If, then, it is asserted that there is a comprehensive formula including all things which are in themselves good, and that whatever else is good is not so as an end, but as a means, the formula may be accepted or rejected, but it is not a subject of what is commonly understood by proof. We are not, however, to infer that its acceptance or rejection must depend on blind impulse or arbitrary choice. There is a larger meaning of the word proof, in which this question is as amenable to it as any other of the disputed questions of philosophy. The subject is within the cognizance of the rational faculty, and neither does that faculty deal with it solely in the way of intuition. Considerations may be presented capable of determining the intellect either to give or withhold its assent to the doctrine, and this is equivalent to proof. We shall examine presently of what nature are these considerations, in what manner they apply to the case, and what rational grounds therefore can be given for accepting or rejecting the utilitarian formula. But it is a preliminary condition of rational acceptance or rejection that the formula should be correctly understood. It's interesting to think about here the fact that Bergson's intuitionism is an empirical intuitionism. The intuition of concrete duration is what is unique to the outside world, and not just the world, but every particularity of the world, and unique to the interiority of every particularity of the outside world. And where there's no outside world, it's just an access to truth. And the access does refine itself in the way that he's talking about by withholding or giving assent through processing considerations. I believe that the very imperfect notion ordinarily formed of its meaning is the chief obstacle which impedes its reception, and that, could it be cleared even from only the grosser misconceptions, the question would be greatly simplified, and a large proportion of its difficulties removed. Before, therefore, I attempt to enter into the philosophical grounds which can be given for assenting to the utilitarian standard, I shall offer some illustrations of the doctrine itself, with the view of showing more clearly what it is, distinguishing it from what it is not, and disposing of such of the practical objections to it as either originate in or are closely connected with mistaken interpretations of its meaning. Having thus prepared the ground, I shall afterwards endeavor to throw such light as I can upon the question considered as one of philosophical theory. And that's the end of chapter 1. It's not going to be into this video because we still have plenty of time left. But we're going to dig into chapter 2. Chapter 2. What Utilitarianism is. A passing remark is all that needs to be given to the ignorant blunder of supposing that those who stand up for utility as the test of right and wrong use the term in that restricted and merely colloquial sense in which utility is opposed to pleasure. An apology is due to the philosophical opponents of utilitarianism for even the momentary appearance of confounding them with anyone capable of so absurd a misconception, which is the more extraordinary inasmuch as the contrary accusation of referring everything to pleasure, and that too, in its grossest form, is another of the common charges against utilitarianism, and has been pointedly remarked by an able writer. The same sort of persons, and often the very same persons, denounce the theory, quote, as impracticably dry, or impracticably dry, when the word utility precedes the word pleasure. I said this in the very first episode. And as too practicably voluptuous when the word pleasure precedes the word utility. Those who know anything about the matter are aware that every writer from Epicurus to Bentham who mentioned the theory of utility meant by it not something to be contradistinguished from pleasure, but pleasure itself, together with exemption from pain, and instead of opposing the useful to the agreeable, or the ornamental, have always declared that the useful means these among other things. Yet the common herd, including the herd of writers, not only in newspapers and periodicals, but in books of weight and pretension, are perpetually falling into this shallow mistake, having caught up the word utilitarian, while knowing nothing whatever about it but its sound. They habitually express by it the rejection or the neglect of pleasure in some of its forms, of beauty, of ornament, or of amusement. Nor is the term thus ignorantly misapplied solely in disparagement, but occasionally in compliment, as though it implied superiority to frivolity and the mere pleasures of the moment. What might be criticized here is that utilitarianism seems to extrapolate pleasure from the giver of pleasure. So there's a sort of individualism that denigrates the experience of being with the world by focusing on the pleasure or the utility of it. Those who introduced the word, but who had for many years discontinued it as a distinctive appellation, may well now may well feel themselves called upon to resume it, if by doing so they can hope to contribute anything toward rescuing it from this utter degradation. The creed, which accepts as the foundation of morals utility, or the quote, greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. To give a clear view of the moral standards set up by the theory, much more requires to be said. In particular, what things it includes in the ideas of pain and pleasure, and to what extent this is left an open question. But these supplementary explanations do not affect the theory of life, on which this theory of morality is grounded. Namely, that pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends, and that all desirable things, which are as numerous in the utilitarian as in any other scheme, are desirable either for pleasure inherent in themselves or as means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain. Directly going to give you the intrinsic good or going to like progress a chain towards the intrinsic good of pleasure and the absence of pain. Now, such a theory of life excites in many minds, and among them, in some of the most estimable in feeling and purpose, inveterate dislike. To suppose that life has, as they express it, no higher end than pleasure, no better and nobler object of desire and pursuit, they designate as utterly mean and groveling, as a doctrine worthy only of swine, to whom the followers of Epicurus were, at a very early period, contemptuously likened. And modern holders of the doctrine are occasionally made the subject of equally polite comparisons by its German, French, and English assailants. When thus attacked, the Epicureans have always answered that it is not they, but their accusers, who represent human nature in a degrading light, since the accusation supposes human beings to be capable of no pleasures except those of which swine are capable. If this supposition were true, the charge could not be gainsaid, but would then be no longer an imputation, for if the sources of pleasure were precisely the same to human beings and to swine, the rule of life which is good enough for the one would be good enough for the other. The comparison of the Epicurean life to that of beasts is felt as degrading, precisely because a beast's pleasures do not satisfy a human being's conceptions of happiness. Human beings have faculties more elevated than the animal appetites, and, when once made conscious of them, do not regard anything as happiness which does not include their gratification. This is the higher pleasures where the quality matters, the nobility, the character, things like that. It's one of the redeeming qualities I find in Mill and why I really don't, um, I find his utilitarianism to be the most palatable. And I really like On Liberty. I do not indeed consider the Epicureans to have by any means faultless in drawing out their scheme of consequences from the utilitarian principle. To do this in any sufficient manner, many Stoic as well as Christian elements required to be included. But there is no known Epicurean theory of life, which does not assign to the pleasures of the intellect, of the feelings and imagination, and of the moral sentiments a much higher value as pleasures than to those of mere sensation. It must be admitted, however, that utilitarian writers in general have placed the superiority of mental over bodily pleasures, chiefly in the greater permanency, safety, and costliness, etc., of the former, that is, in their circumstantial advantages rather than in their intrinsic nature. And on all these points, utilitarians have fully proved their case. But they might have taken the other, and as it were, and as it may be called, higher ground with entire consistency. It is quite compatible with the principle of utility to recognize the fact that some kinds of pleasure are more desirable and more valuable than others. It would be absurd that, while in estimating all other things, quality is considered as well as quantity. The estimation of pleasure should be supposed to depend on quantity alone. If I am asked what I mean by difference of quality and pleasures, or what makes one pleasure more valuable than another, merely as a pleasure, except its being greater in amount, there is but one possible answer. Of two pleasures, if there be one to which all or almost all who have experience of both give a decided preference, irrespective of any feeling of moral obligation to prefer it, that is the more desirable pleasure. If one of the two is by those who are competently acquainted with both placed so far above the other, they prefer it, even though knowing it to be attended with a greater amount of discontent, and would not resign it for any quantity of the other pleasure, which their nature is capable of, we are justified in ascribing to the preferred enjoyment a superiority in quality, so far outweighing a quantity as to render it, in comparison, of small account. Yeah, like virtue, purity of soul, is of like Socrates at his trial, right? There's a quality of purity of soul that is more valuable than any kind of money could buy, because by pursuing like a great amount of wealth, you would lose that. Now, it is an unquestionable fact that those who are equally acquainted with um, and equally capable of appreciating and enjoying both do give a most marked preference to the manner of existence which employs their higher faculties. Few human creatures would consent to be changed into any of the lower animals for a promise of the fullest allowance of a beast's pleasures, right? You don't want to lose like your character. No intelligent human being would consent to be a fool. No instructed person would be an ignoramus. No person of feeling and conscience would be selfish and base, even though they should be persuaded that the fool, the dunce, or the rascal is better satisfied with his lot than they are with theirs. They would not resign what they possess more than he for the most complete satisfaction of all the desires which they have in common with him. If they ever fancy they would, it is only in cases of unhappiness so extreme that to escape from it, they would exchange their lot for almost any other, however undesirable in their own eyes. A being of higher faculties requires more to make him happy, as that's strange. I don't know why there's a purple heart there. I don't think that's drawn in my original copy. I should get up and find out. So yeah, that's in the copy. The stippling you can see behind the purple heart is the bleed from the annotations on the reverse side of the page. And there's another purple heart on the next page. I guess I just put it there because I really liked what it said. So, a being of higher faculties requires more to make him happy, is capable probably of more acute suffering, and certainly accessible to it at more points. than one of the inferior type. But in spite of these liabilities, he can never really wish to sink into what he feels to be a lower grade of existence. We may give what explanation we please of this unwillingness. We may attribute it to pride, a name which is given indiscriminately to some of the most and to some of the least estimable feelings of which mankind are capable. We may refer it um, to the love of liberty and personal independence, an appeal to which was with the Stoics one of the most effective means for the inculcation of it, to the love of power or to the love of excitement, both of which do not really enter and contribute to it. But its most appropriate appellation is a sense of dignity, which all human beings possess in one form or other, and in some, though by no means an exact proportion to their higher faculties, and which is so essential a part of the happiness of those in whom it is so strong, that nothing which conflicts with it could be otherwise than momentarily an object of desire to them. Whoever supposes that this preference takes place at a sacrifice of happiness, that the superior being, in anything like equal circumstances, is not happier than the inferior, confounds the two very different ideas of happiness and content. It is indisputable that the being whose capacities of enjoyment are low has the greatest chance of having them satisfied, fully satisfied. And a highly endowed being will always feel that any happiness which he can look for as the world is constituted is imperfect. But he can learn to bear its imperfections if they are at all if they are at all bearable, and they will not make him envy the being who is indeed unconscious of the imperfections, but only because he feels not at all the good which those imperfections qualify. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are of a different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides. It may be objected that many who are capable of the higher pleasures occasionally, under the influence of temptation, postpone them to the lower, but this is quite compatible with a full appreciation of the intrinsic superiority of the higher. Men often, from infirmity of character, make their election for the nearer good, though they know it to be the less valuable, and this no less when the choice is between two bodily pleasures than when it is between bodily and mental. What I like about Mill is that another thing I like about him is that it's not just a bunch of calculations and math. It's not like mathematical philosophy. Like he has qualitative considerations, meaning if you take the GRE one day, there's quantitative reasoning and qualitative reasoning is just language. Quantitative reasoning will be like shapes and numbers and logic, quote unquote. There's also a writing sample. Um, yeah. So he has qualitative, I don't want to say positivist necessarily, but he does have good qualitative descriptions or presentations or argumentation. I'm going to repeat a little bit. They pursue sensual indulgences to the injury of health, though perfectly aware that health is the greater good. It may be further objected that many who begin with youthful enthusiasm for everything noble, as they advance in years, sink into indolence and selfishness. But I do not believe that those who undergo this very common change voluntarily choose the lower description of pleasures in preference to the higher. I believe that before they devote themselves exclusively to the one, they have already become incapable of the other. Capacity for other nobler feelings is in most natures a very tender plant, easily killed, not only by hostile influences, but by mere want of sustenance. And in the majority of young persons, it speedily dies away if the occupations to which their position in life has devoted them. Um, and the society into which it has thrown them are not favorable to keeping a higher capacity and exercise. Men lose their high aspirations as they lose their intellectual tastes, because they have no time or opportunity for indulging them, and they addict themselves to inferior pleasures, not because they deliberately prefer them, because they are either the only ones to which they have access or the only ones which they are any longer capable of enjoying. It may be questioned whether anyone who has remained equally susceptible to both classes of pleasures ever knowingly and calmly preferred the lower, though many, in all ages, have broken down in an ineffectual attempt to combine both. From this verdict of the only competent judges, I apprehend there can be no appeal on a question which is the best worth of having of two pleasures, or which of two modes of existence is the most grateful to the feelings. Apart from its moral attributes and from its consequences, the judgment of those who are qualified by knowledge of both, or if they differ, that of the majority among them, must be admitted as final. And there needs be the less hesitation to accept this judgment respecting the quality of pleasures, since there is no other tribunal to be referred to even on the question of quantity. What means are there of determining which is the acutest of two pains, or the intensest of two pleasurable sensations? Accept the general suffrage of those who are familiar with both. Neither pains nor pleasures are homogeneous, and pain is always heterogeneous with pleasure. What is there to decide whether a particular pleasure is worth purchasing at the cost of a particular pain, except the feelings and judgment of the experienced? When, therefore, those feelings and judgment declare the pleasures derived from the higher faculties be preferable in kind, this is like the ordinal utilitarian judgment or ordinal ranking. Apart from the question of intensity to those of which the animal nature, disjoined from the higher faculties, is susceptible, they are entitled on the subject to the same regard. I have dwelt on this point as being a necessary part of a perfectly just conception of utility. All right, give me 1 second. Also, I think I saw a fly in here. All right, I just had to check something. Um, I have dwelt on this point as being a necessary part of a perfectly just conception of utility or happiness, considered as the directive rule of human conduct, but it is by no means an indispensable condition to the acceptance of the utilitarian standard. For that standard is not the agent's own greatest happiness, but the greatest amount of happiness altogether, and if it may possibly be doubted whether a noble character is always the happier for its nobleness, there can be no doubt that it makes other people happier, and that the world in general is immensely a gainer by it. Utilitarianism, therefore, could only attain its end by the general cultivation of nobleness of character, even if each individual were only benefited by the nobleness of others, and his own, so far as happiness is concerned, were a sheer deduction from the benefit. But the bare enunciation of such an absurdity as this last renders refutation superfluous. According to the greatest happiness principle, as above explained, the ultimate end, with reference to and for the sake of which all other things are desirable, whether we are considering our own good or that of other people, is an existence exempt as far as possible from pain, and as rich as possible in enjoyments, both in point of quantity and quality. The test of quality and the rule of measuring it against quantity being the preference felt by those who, in their opportunities of experience, to which must be added their habits of self-consciousness and self-observation, are best furnished with a means of comparison. This is the competent judges, I think. This being, according to the utilitarian opinion, the end of human action, is necessarily also the standard of morality, which may accordingly be defined, quote, the rules and precepts for human conduct, end quote, by the observance of which an existence, such as has been described, might be, to the greatest extent possible, secured to all mankind, and not to them only, but, so far as the nature of things admits, to the whole sentient creature. To the whole sentient creation, not creature, sorry. So, animals and other, yes. So animal rights, basically. Against this doctrine, however, and like environmental rights, arises another class of objectors who say that happiness in any form cannot be the rational purpose of human life and action, because in the first place it is unattainable, and they contemptuously ask, "What right hast thou to be happy?" A question which Mr. Carlyle clinches by the addition, "What right a short time ago hadst thou even to be?" Next, they say that men can do without happiness, that all noble human beings have felt this, and could not have become noble but by learning the lesson of entsagen, or renunciation, which lesson, thoroughly learned and submitted to, they affirm to be the beginning and necessary condition of all virtue. The first of these objections would go to the root of the matter, and were it well founded, for if no happiness is to be had at all by human beings, the attainment of it cannot be the end of morality or of any rational conduct, though even in that case, something might still be said for the utilitarian theory, since utility includes not solely the pursuit of happiness, but the prevention or mitigation of unhappiness. And if the former aim be chimerical, there will be all the greater scope and more imperative need for the latter, so long at least as mankind think fit to live and do not take refuge in the simultaneous act of suicide recommended under certain conditions by Novalis. When, however, it is thus positively asserted to be impossible that human life should be happy, the assertion, if not something like a verbal quibble, is at least an exaggeration. If by happiness be meant a continuity of highly pleasurable excitement, it is evident enough that this is impossible. A state of exalted pleasure lasts only moments, or in some cases, and with some intermissions, hours or days, and is the occasional brilliant flash of enjoyment, nor its permanent and steady flame. Not its permanent and steady flame. Of this, the philosophers who have taught that happiness is the end of life were as fully aware as those who taunt them. The happiness which they meant was not a life of rapture, but moments of such, in an existence made up of few and transitory pains, many and various pleasures, with a decided predominance of the active over the passive, and having, as the foundation of the whole, not to expect more from life than it is capable of bestowing. So this is a really good formulation of that, of Mill's definition of happiness. A life thus composed to those who have been fortunate enough to obtain it has always appeared worthy of the name of happiness, and such an existence is even now the lot of many during some considerable portion of their lives. The present wretched education and wretched social arrangements are the only real hindrance to its being attainable by almost all. The objectors perhaps may doubt whether human beings, if taught to consider happiness as the end of life, would be satisfied with such a moderate share of it. But great numbers of mankind have been satisfied with much less. The main constituents of a satisfied life appear to be two, either of which, by itself, is often found sufficient for the purpose: tranquility and excitement. With much tranquility, many find that they can be content with very little pleasure. With much excitement, many can reconcile themselves to a considerable quantity of pain. There is assuredly no inherent impossibility of enabling even the mass of mankind to unite both, since the two are so far from being incompatible that they are in natural alliance, the prolongation of either being a preparation for and exciting a wish for the other. It is only those in whom indolence amounts to a vice that do not desire excitement after an interval of repose. It is only those in whom the need of excitement is a disease that feel the tranquility which follows excitement dull and insipid, instead of pleasurable in direct proportion to the excitement which preceded it. This reminds me of the need for rest and activity, or for strife and resolution or harmony in Dewey's production of gratification, aesthetic gratification, in Art as Experience, chapters 1 through 3. When people who are tolerably fortunate in their outward lot do not find in life sufficient enjoyment to make it valuable to them, the cause generally is caring for nobody but themselves. To those who have neither public nor private affections, the excitements of life are much curtailed, in any case dwindle in value as the time approaches when all selfish interests must be terminated by death. While those who leave after them objects of personal affection, and especially those who have also cultivated a fellow feeling with the collective interests of mankind, retain as lively an interest in life on the eve of death as in the vigor of youth and health. Next to selfishness, the principal cause which makes life unsatisfactory is want of mental cultivation. A cultivated mind, I do not mean that of a philosopher, but any mind to which the foundations of knowledge have been opened, and which has been taught in any tolerable degree to exercise its faculties, finds sources of inexhaustible interest in all that surrounds it, in the objects of nature, the achievements of art, the imaginations of poetry, the incidents of history, the ways of mankind, past and present, and their prospects in the future. It is possible, indeed, to become indifferent to all this, and that too without having exhausted a thousandth part of it, but only when one has had from the beginning no moral or human interest in these things, and has sought in them only the gratification of curiosity. Now, there is absolutely no reason in the nature of things why an amount of mental culture sufficient to give an intelligent interest in these objects of contemplation should not be the inheritance of everyone born in a civilized country. As little is there um, as little is there an inherent necessity that any human being should be a selfish egotist, devoid of every feeling. I've been saying egoist, but egotist is the same. Devoid of um, every feeling or care about those which center in his own miserable individuality. Something far superior to this is sufficiently common even now to give ample earnest um, of what the human species may be made. Genuine private affections and a sincere interest in the public good are possible, though in equal degrees, to every rightly brought up human being. In a world in which there is so much to interest, so much to enjoy, and so much also to correct and improve, everyone who has this moderate amount of moral and intellectual requisites is capable of an existence, which may be called enviable, and unless such a person, through bad laws or subjection to the will of others, is denied the liberty to use the sources of happiness within his reach, he will not fail to find this enviable existence. If he escapes the positive of evils of life, the great sources of physical and mental suffering, such as indigence, disease, and the unkindness, worthlessness, or premature loss of objects of affection. The main stress of the problem lies, therefore, in the contest with these calamities from which it is a rare good fortune entirely to escape, which, as things now are, cannot be obviated or avoided, and often cannot be in any material degree mitigated. Yet no one whose opinion deserves a moment's consideration can doubt that most of the great positive evils of the world are in themselves removable and will, if human affairs continue to improve, be in the end reduced within narrow limits. Poverty, in any sense implying suffering, may be completely extinguished by the wisdom of society combined with the good sense and providence of individuals. Even that most intractable of enemies, disease, may be indefinitely reduced in dimensions by good physical and moral education and proper control of noxious influences, while the progress of science holds out a promise for the future of still more direct conquests over this detestable foe. And every advance in that direction relieves us from some, not only of the chances which cut short our own lives, but what concerns us still more, which deprive us of those in whom our happiness is wrapped up. As for vicissitudes of fortune and other disappointments connected with worldly circumstances, these are principally the effect either of gross imprudence or ill-regulated desires, or of bad or imperfect social institutions. All the grand sources, in short, of human suffering are in a great degree, many of them most entirely, conquerable by human care and effort. And though their removal is grievously slow, though a long succession of generations will perish in the breach before the conquest is completed, and this world becomes all that, if will and knowledge were not wanting, it might easily be made. Yet every mind, sufficiently intelligent and generous to bear a part, however small and inconspicuous, in the endeavor will draw a noble enjoyment from the contest itself, which he would not for any bribe in the form of selfish indulgence consent to be without. And this leads to the true estimation of what is said by the objectors concerning the possibility and the obligation of learning to do without happiness. Unquestionably, it is possible to do without happiness. It is done involuntarily by 19/20ths of mankind, even in those parts of our present world which are least deep in barbarism. And it often has to be done voluntarily by the hero or the martyr for the sake of something which he prizes more than his individual happiness. But this something, what is it? Unless the happiness of others or some of the requisites of happiness. It is noble to be capable of resigning entirely one's own portion of happiness or chances of it. But after all, this self-sacrifice must be for some end. It is not its own end, and if we are told that its end is not happiness by virtue, which is better than happiness, I ask, um, virtue being better than happiness, I ask, would the sacrifice be made if the hero or martyr did not believe that it would earn for others immunity from similar sacrifices? Would it be made if he thought that his renunciation of happiness for himself would produce no fruit for any of his fellow creatures, but to make their lot like his, and place them also in the condition of persons who have renounced happiness? All honor to those who can abnegate for themselves the personal enjoyment of life, when by such renunciation they contribute worthily to increase the amount of happiness in the world. But he who does it or professes to do it for any other purpose is no more deserving of admiration than the ascetic mounted on his pillar. He, Winchester, stop. He may be an inspiring proof of what men can do, but assuredly not an example of what they should. Um, we have, it's about like halfway and it's been about an hour, so we probably need to break this into a second episode. It's only going to be a half of page 22, but we have, I guess, 8 pages left. Uh, 9, no, 8. So we'll call it here because it's been an hour. So, thank you guys. Um, this was part 4, and part 5 will be our last one. I'll see you soon. Take care. Be well.